Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to the Sawyer Seminar Series, Potentialities of Justice Towards Collective Reparative Futures. I am Maite Green Mercado, one of the PIs with my colleague Lauren Shalish of the Mellon Sawyer grant that is funding this year-long series. I'm also one of the co-organizers of this event, along with my colleagues Rula Segayer, Amir Musavi, and Wendell Marsh. I would like to thank our Sawyer Seminar postdoctoral associate, Ashley Guatney. I would also like to thank Christina Strasburger, Sydney Johnson, Mi Hyun Yun, Christelle Jasmine, Angelica Ferrer, Esperanza Santos, Mustafa Hoshmand, and Cynthia Martins Freitas for their tireless work in making this event possible. I'm also going to give a couple of more thank yous before I begin my remarks. I would like to thank the Federated History Department, the English Department, the Africana Studies Department, Sociology and Anthropology, the Honors College, the Center for Migration and the Global City, the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, the Sheila Y. Oliver Center for Politics and Race in America, NJ STEP, the Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies, the Humanities Action Lab, the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies minor, and the Arabic Language Initiative for their generous support of this seminar series. We would like to offer special thanks to Rutgers Newark Chancellor Jeffrey Robinson and Newark School of Arts and Sciences Dean Jacqueline Mattis for their commitment and support of this initiative. And last but not least, I would like to offer a warm welcome to our speakers and thank them for accepting our invitation to join us in these critical conversations. How can one offer meaningful words to introduce the subject of today's seminar, Aftermaths of War, Memory and Histories for the Future, a subject that is regrettably timely and urgently necessary? I will start with an anecdote of a trip. Some summers ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Sarajevo with my dear colleague Leila Amzi Dordular to set up a study abroad program she was organizing as part of a new course that she's developing on history and memory. After a bumpy start with a missed flight from Belgrade to Sarajevo, Leila arranged for me to continue my journey by taxi, which would take more than 7 hours for a distance of little more than 180 miles. I was riding with a Serbian taxi driver who spoke English and clearly knew where he was going, even though he claimed to have never set foot in Bosnia. The man was a little older than me, so there was a good chance that he had participated in the war. I won't go into details about the way that he characterized the events that had taken place 30-some years ago. They were so disturbing that I feigned sleep for the rest of the ride. It was past 1 a.m. when I arrived in Sarajevo, a vibrant city that proudly displayed traces of more distant pasts, with its restored Ottoman mosques, libraries, Habsburg palaces, but also a city that bore the scars of more recent presence. During our trip, we talked to university professors, museum directors, friends, and colleagues. We visited a museum that told the story of the war and genocide through the objects and testimonies of children who lived through it. We went to the town of Mostar, whose beautiful bridge was destroyed during the war and carefully restored to its original glory. We walked around a walled 14th century town nested on the left bank of the Neretva River, whose population was ethnically cleansed almost in its entirety. During our trip, I was struck by how much the memory of the genocide was still alive in everyday conversations. Everyone I spoke to wanted to tell their stories about war. Their voices expressed a desire for the world to acknowledge that a genocide had taken place. Everyone seemed, at least to me, to be expressing an ongoing demand for justice. Maya Angelou's words resonated during that trip. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. That trip, the country, its people, and the histories and memories of war, genocide, and displacement have stayed with me, though these are not my stories to tell. But I start with this story of my visit to the beautiful country of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the conversations that we had with people there as I reflect on some questions that guide this seminar. How can histories of violence be narrated? How might these stories that are narrated and histories that are written produce more critical, complex, and nuanced pictures so that they attend not simply to the individual experience of victimization, but that might shed light on experiences of political agency, as well as contexts of power struggles, thus capturing longer historical processes. More crucially, how can these histories be told so that they might serve to repair? To narrate is to remember, and as Marina Warner reminds us in her foreword to the recent English translation of the late Radwa Ashur's trilogy, Granada, the act of memory is reparatory and life. So as we bear witness to a new genocide in Gaza, according to a recent UN Human Rights Office report, close to 70% of those killed in Gaza are women and children, and the physical toll of the war has created a whole generation of disabled children. And as a war continues to rage on multiple fronts in Palestine, Lebanon, Sudan, Ukraine, there is a renewed urgency to document human rights violations, acknowledge the experiences of those who are suffering, and redress harms done. How might we think of aftermaths in order to reshape futures in contemporary sites where genocide and war are ongoing? With this, I invite us all to bear witness to these past and present histories and memories in the aftermaths of war, so that we may never remain silent in the face of oppression and injustice, so that we may forge collective reparative futures. Now, my colleague Wendell Marsh will offer some remarks. Thank you.
Umuntu, ngumuntu, ngabantu. A person is a person through people. This is a Zulu expression that comes from folk wisdom. And there are other versions of this expression found throughout Southern Africa, Central Africa, and Eastern Africa, throughout the areas associated with the so-called Bantu language families. In addition to being a kind of folk saying, a timeless wisdom, we should appreciate in this expression a ontology, a philosophy of being. It is a philosophy that begins and ends with sociality and solidarity. And so the few remarks I want to give help us to connect our discussion today about the power of narratives in the aftermath of war with the broader conversation that we're having as a part of the Sawyer seminar on justice. And I want to offer this idea that a person is a person through people as a way of redescribing what we mean by justice. So, in addition to being a ontology, Ubuntu, which is how philosophers and theorists, particularly in South Africa, have thought of Ubuntu. They thought of it in moral terms and in political terms, and they have also kind of reframed this idea through the formula, I am because we are. Now, anyone who has taken an introduction to philosophy or been around the block at all will immediately recognize its similar structure to a famous statement that's supposed to embody Western philosophy by Descartes that says, I think, therefore I am. And this formulation, these two formulations are juxtaposed to represent different kind of worldviews, right? In the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, what we have is reason preceding being. In contrast, in the philosophy of Ubuntu, being rests on sociality and solidarity. So I want to offer that we might think of justice in this philosophy as centering the shared recognition of mutual humanity, right? And so injustice is the violation of this understanding, right? It is the failure to recognize the other through oneself and vice versa, the failure to recognize oneself in the other. And so the implication is that injustice tears the links of sociality and solidarity, and in the process makes us less human, right? In other words, injustice dehumanizes, of course, those facing the oppression, but also those performing the injustice, right? It is a tear in the world. Now, this idea, of course, was explored in the work of Aimé Césaire and his discourse on colonialism, when he talks about the way of thinking about colonization as civilization. He says, no, in fact, it is a way of decivilizing society. And even though there's this talk of achieving human potential, civilization in the form of colonization has meant dehumanization. So there's a really important insight there in connecting colonialism and injustice. And as we're thinking about the seminars that are part of the Sawyer seminar, the 4 events, the 2 this semester, 2 in the spring, we've been reading and thinking about, among other works, Reconsidering Reparations by Olufemi Taiwo. And he has a very useful concept of global racial empire, right? And he uses global racial empire to describe the world order since the 15th century that has been built by and through genocide, the theft of land, and the theft of people, right? This process remade the world with war, right? All of those things, genocide, land theft, slavery, they all require war. And so the remaking of the world since the 15th century was remade with the world, with war, and it requires war to maintain it. So I don't want to suggest that all war is a direct result of global racial empire, but global racial empire as our current system is maintained through it. So that's really important for us to remember in this conversation about the aftermaths of war. And an important case study for us to think about is apartheid in South Africa. So apartheid was a system that bifurcated society between 1948 in the 1990s, in which one land was divided for two peoples through violence on an ongoing basis. After a prolonged resistance, right, and this is the nature of injustice, there's always a resistance to the injustice at the time. There's often revolt and rebellion, right? And after the injustice, there's the need to remember, there's the need to repair, and only then, maybe, there's the possibility of reconciliation. And so, after a prolonged resistance against the injustice of racial segregation that was apartheid in South Africa, a resistance that was organic and internal, one that used every means necessary, physical, political, economic, and moral, and a global solidarity movement of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, the injustice was put to an end. Now, in South Africa, the question arose, how would two people in one land come to live together? And of course, this is the story of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his development of Ubuntu as a philosophy that I started with today. And the kind of model that we have around truth and reconciliation, of course, was really elaborated through the aftermath of the end of apartheid. And there are many critiques of that process that many of you will be familiar with and we can think through. But I wanted to bring that into our conversation today to both think about the nature of justice and injustice, and to remember the role that global racial empire plays through its, in an ongoing way, to sustain it. Now we're going to, Now we're going to introduce, or Maite is going to come back and introduce our next introduction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi again, everyone. I would like to welcome Professor Tim Raphael, who is the director of Newest Americans and the Center for Migration in the Global City, who is going to frame the video that we're going to watch now that is going to set us up for the conversation, the workshop that we will be having. So Tim, please. And thank you, Wando.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm going to make this very brief. The origins of this short film you're about to see began about 8 years ago when Dr. Muñoz was a Fulbright Fellow at the at Rutgers Newark, working with Liz Shevchenko, who will meet later this afternoon if you don't know her already, with the Humanities Action Lab. And during that semester, the center that I run, the Center for Migration in the Global City, shares an office with the Humanities Action Lab. And I had the opportunity to have several conversations with Dr. Muñoz about her remarkable public history project, Historias que viene, which you'll hear more about in her presentation. But what it led to for me is a reconsideration of some of the work that we had been doing with our Newest Americans project, which is a multimedia storytelling project around immigration and identity that really comes out of the remarkable diversity of our campus. And we had just begun to take what had been a very hyper-local project and start to tell that story from sending context. We've just done a short film in Guatemala and another one in Malta. And Dr. Muñoz asked if we would be interested in coming to Colombia to document one of the projects that Historias para lo que viene was involved in at the time. And so we did. And the only thing I want to say is that what I found particularly impressive, particularly fruitful, particularly novel about the work that she was doing is I was aware of a lot of the memory work that was being done in Colombia to give voice to the people who had been the victims of violence over a 60 years of the largest internecine conflict in the world. Well, arguably, at least in the Americas. And what I was struck by was that the work that she and her colleagues at the Universidad de los Andes were doing with the Historias project was to not primarily be looking at the violence and the trauma it produced itself, but at the possibility for, as the project describes, Historias para lo que viene is roughly translated as histories for the future, or histories for what's to come. And it was a novel approach in Latin America, and still a novel approach in most memory work that's done around the world. And you'll hear a lot more about that today. But that's what the film was trying to capture in this project in Suba.
Thank you, Tim. So it is my really great pleasure and honor to introduce our first speaker of the seminar, Dr. Catalina Muñoz, who is an associate professor of history at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, in Bogotá. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and her work approaches historical thinking and longue durée analysis as a collaborative and forward-looking endeavor to advance social justice. Her production, Nuestra Orilla, 2023, a podcast series produced in two Afro-Colombian community leaders, challenges the methodologies, temporalities, and ways of narrating the histories of violence in Colombia by centering the perspective of those most affected by it. She has been a visiting research scholar at Princeton University's Program for Latin American Studies. She has been a member of the Institute for Advanced Studies and a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Humanities Action Lab here at Rutgers Newark. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Muñoz. Thank you. I want to just get her talking as soon as possible, right?
Moverse hacia el futuro y hacia la construcción de paz es imposible si no reconocemos lo que ocurrió. ¿Cierto? Las víctimas quieren contar sus historias para que quienes no han vivido el conflicto sepan que esto ocurrió y sobre todo entiendan su lugar en eso que ocurrió.
Colombia celebra el acuerdo histórico entre el gobierno del presidente Juan Manuel Santos y la guerrilla de las FARC, que pone fin a más de 50 años de guerra en ese país.
Hoy comienza el fin del sufrimiento, el dolor y la tragedia de la guerra. Hoy, 24 de agosto del año 2016, podemos decir que esa esperanza nacional se ha vuelto realidad.
En más de un siglo se lograron por fin aunar suficientes voluntades para decir no a los amigos de la guerra que durante tanto tiempo se apoderaron del acontecer nacional para sumirlo en un caos interminable y doloroso.
Entonces nosotros empezamos, como les comentaba, como una colaboración entre universidades, comunicadores, y ahora pues estamos extendiendo las manos para aliarnos con comunidades como ustedes, con el objetivo de utilizar la historia para construcción de paz en Colombia.
Estoy contenta con mi tierra, con mi música, aunque allá me sacaron muy feo, me tocó salir mejor. A ella me le dieron 24 horas de vida, me tocó salir porque fue víctima de una explosión. Me vine a mi tierra, pero la llevo en el alma, en mi sangre, en mi ser, en todo. Así es.
Nuestro proyecto se llama Historias para lo que viene, y lo que queremos con eso es generar historias que no se queden en el pasado, sino que hagan la historia relevante para lo que viene, para la construcción de paz. En ese sentido nos interesan historias que no se concentren en reconstruir aquello que ocurrió, sino que piensen en qué podemos hacer para la reconciliación.
Para mí ha sido muy duro el tener que aceptar que mis hijos hayan tenido que salir de mi tierra juntamente conmigo. Para mí ha sido muy duro. Pero algo que me satisface es que aún estoy viva. Y le digo a mis hijos y a cada una de las mujeres que Dios ha puesto en mi camino y que yo he podido ayudar a salir adelante, es que ellas no están solas. Y que mientras yo respire, ahí voy a estar, dándolo todo por cada una de ellas, ayudándolas a salir adelante.
La mayoría del trabajo de memoria que se ha hecho en Colombia ha venido desde organismos oficiales, como el Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica. Ha sido tremendamente valioso porque Colombia era un país donde era necesario escuchar a las víctimas. Y ahora estamos entrando en una fase donde necesitamos un poco más de reflexión sobre esas memorias. Una carta dirigida a un niño para que podamos pensar hacia el futuro, donde yo condense mi historia. Esta fase del proyecto está compuesta por 3 talleres. En un primer taller reunimos personas que quieren compartir su testimonio y lo que hacemos es trabajar desde la historia oral para que ellos compongan los elementos que quieren incluir en la audiocarta en la que van a contar su historia.
¿Cómo se le dice a ese cambio? Un cambio extraordinario, no puede ser. Un cambio brusco.
Hicimos un ejercicio en el que pusimos a las personas afectadas por el conflicto en parejas.
¿Cómo es tu nombre? Mi nombre es Isaac.
El objetivo es que las personas se contaran sus historias entre ellos. No queríamos tener un formato de entrevista donde alguien externo viene a pedirle el testimonio a alguien, sino que queríamos que personas afectadas de manera distinta por el conflicto tuvieran la oportunidad de contarle su historia a otra persona afectada y también de escuchar la historia de la otra persona.
Pero tenían muchas problemáticas.
Porque es que lo que se vivió fue muy fuerte. Y el solo hecho de yo ver a Gladys aquí sentada contando parte de su historia para mí es un gran orgullo. ¿Oíste? Porque cuando yo conocí a Gladys no hablaba de eso.
Para el próximo sábado, clave que traigan su carta escrita y traigan, si quieren, fotografías para incluir, si quieren traer personas de su familia para el retrato familiar, el niño al que está dirigido, están muy bienvenidos. Decidimos hacer este piloto del proyecto en Suba, en buena medida por el contacto que establecimos desde el inicio con Miguel Chiape. Miguel es un comunicador que trabaja hace un tiempo en una radio comunitaria en Suba que se llama Suba al Aire.
Suba al Aire, 88.4. Cuéntame esas historias de Colombia, porque la historia siempre ha sido contada por los vencedores y en esta historia solo han existido víctimas. La experiencia de poder desarrollar este taller que parte precisamente de la memoria histórica es la importancia de reconocer también que cada una de esas historias tiene que salvaguardarse y brindársele a la futura generación pues la posibilidad de reconocer esa emoción y ese sentimiento y ese recuerdo que tiene cada una de las personas sobre el conflicto armado.
En un segundo taller nos reunimos con cada uno de ellos para grabar esa audiocarta que ellos traen, tomar un retrato de las personas que pueden ser ellos solos o con sus hijos a quienes les están dirigiendo la carta. También vamos a hacer un ejercicio de cartografía para rastrear sobre un mapa su recorrido por el país. Y finalmente escaneamos fotos que ellos puedan traer que son representativas de ese pasado o fotografiamos objetos que ellos también quieran compartir con nosotros. Entonces lo que queremos es producir historias inicialmente para radios regionales en Colombia, haciendo pequeñas pildoritas en torno a la experiencia de alguien contextualizada.
Durante el conflicto han existido lugares que no han sido posible llegar allí caminando, entonces la radio ha sido una forma muy importante para comunicarse por parte de todas las comunidades.
Y si ya no vuelvo, y si ya no vuelvo, espera en mis sueños, espera en mis sueños, duérmete en mis brazos, duérmete en mis brazos, que yo estoy contigo, que yo estoy contigo. Esto es el recuerdo más bello que tengo cada vez que recuerdo cada patada que dabas en mi vientre y el deseo de que nacieras en un ambiente sano, alegre, sin miedos y sin amenazas.
Esta es mi historia para lo que viene.
Hija de la guerra, no se hace más guerra. Debemos perdonar.
Es importante que ustedes como niños, como jóvenes, empiecen a entender de que sí vale la pena luchar por una paz.
Otra cosa que les quiero dejar, un país que no sea tan desigual, que nos miremos todos unos a otros como lo que somos, hermanos.
Cuídate mucho, mujer. Te me cuidas, cualquier cosa. Tú sabes que puedes contar conmigo siempre, siempre. Yo voy a estar ahí.
Como el trabajo final, es grupal.
Con todo este material vamos a producir unos libritos que son como un mini álbum familiar. Bueno, buenas tardes, vamos a arrancar nuestra reunión de hoy entonces. Donde está transcrita la carta que la persona le hace a sus hijos, junto con estas imágenes que estamos capturando, el mapa. Vamos a imprimir ese material para que a cada uno de ellos les quede ese librito. Entonces, las tareas son... Yo centralizo, pero entonces es recolectar el material que nos falta. La tercera reunión que vamos a hacer con ellos es un evento para entregarles esto, con una pequeña exposición para la comunidad que colaboró con nosotros, para darles, retribuir ese esfuerzo. Entonces queremos, en nombre de todos, empezar agradeciéndole a cada uno por haberse abierto a compartir con nosotros sus historias, habernos dado la oportunidad de aprender de cada uno de ustedes, y a través de este proyecto esperamos poder llegar a muchas más personas con estas historias.
Esta es la historia para lo que viene.
Mi nombre es Sergio Acevedo. Nací el 2 de julio de 1987 en el corregimiento Viene.
Cuando tienes sueño, cuando tengas problemas, cuando sientas tristeza, recuerda que lo que se aprende en el vientre de una madre nunca se olvida.
Hija, yo te quiero mucho, no lo olvides en el mundo que tú quieras conquistar.
Hija, lucha por lo que quieres, nunca te rindas. Dios está contigo, te amo.
¿Cómo te sentiste oyendo a la mamá?
Me conmovió muchísimo, la verdad, sí. Ya había tenido oportunidad de escucharla, sí, en varios eventos, pero me gustó mucho pues lo del libro, la grabación y eso. O sea, siempre la escuchaba, o sea, hablar y todo, pero nunca, o sea, algo así nunca la había pasado. Y me parece muy bonito porque así, o sea, puede tener un buen recuerdo, sí, de todo lo que ella.
Nuestra historia. Esperamos que este sea un proyecto, por ejemplo, pedagógico, donde los niños en Colombia empiecen a aprender la historia distinta. Y pues para mí en el corazón de todo esto está la Colombia que queremos construir para nuestros hijos.
Set my timer here to make sure I can keep track of time. All right, I'm gonna wait for the slides to come up before I begin. There we go. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm Catalina Muñoz. Very happy to be here, Maite. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to the conversations today and tomorrow with other scholars and activists working around these issues of how to tell our histories in looking towards the future. So in what's coming up, I will be presenting on the process and methodologies that I have been using in my publicly engaged work as a historian oriented towards applying historical thinking to building social justice in Colombia in the context of the transitional justice process we are going through since 2016. This may be a context that some of you are familiar with, while some of you aren't, and that's okay. What I will do is I will present on my particular work in this context, giving you, enough information for you to be able to navigate it, but I will be making pauses to introduce some of the broad questions and issues in some slides that underlie my work. I am hoping that those moments will help you connect with your own interests and concerns, right? These are issues that are relevant not only to my work, but in general. So I'll be presenting for around an hour on these processes and methodologies, and then I will leave 30 minutes at the end so that we can discuss. So please write down your questions, any ideas, connections you might draw between your own interests and what's coming up, and we'll have enough time to discuss at the end. All right. So in 2016, the Colombian government of then President Juan Manuel Santos on the left signed a peace agreement with the FARC, the oldest guerrillas in the Western Hemisphere. This is the historic shaking of hands between President Santos and Timochenko, leader of the FARC, and in the Middle East, Raúl Castro. The peace agreements, the peace dialogues took place in Havana for over 4 years, so they were initially signed there. This was historic in Colombia. It was by no means our first peace agreement. We have a long-standing war and we have been through several transitional justice processes. But this one was historic, mainly because for the first time, the government sat down with one of the armed actors that was giving up arms, and for 4 years, they debated the root causes of conflict. So the agreement was not only an agreement to demobilize an armed group, but they were agreements that tackled the main issues to stop the repetition of violence, mainly unequal access to land. Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in terms of access to land. The problem of drug trafficking, the problem of lack of political participation in the country. So all of these issues were discussed for over 4 years. The numbers today, and let me just add that the conflict is, even though these peace agreements were signed in 2016, the war is ongoing, mainly because the group that demobilized was one, the FARC, the largest guerrilla, but not the only one. So we have part of this guerrilla that didn't demobilize. We have other guerrilla groups like the ELN, the EPL that are still up in arms, and we also have right-wing paramilitary groups that continue fighting around different issues like drug trafficking, traffic of arms, traffic of immigrants now. So it's ongoing. The numbers say that the people victimized by war in Colombia amount to around 10 million people, victims of different human rights violations, including displacement, murder, kidnapping, landmines, recruitment of minors. Yeah, so a very violent conflict. Now, the war cannot be explained only in terms of the guerrilla fighters, right? And that's one of the ways in which Colombian society, we've had a very limited perspective of war, right? Attributing it only to the leftist guerrillas. Our war is older. The guerrillas were formed in the 1960s, but they didn't rise out of the blue. The guerrillas, most of them came out of peasant mobilizations around inequality in access to the land. As the Colombian economy joined world markets with the exports, in our case it was coffee, for the economies in the global north, this meant a lot of pressure over land that dispossessed many peasant families and turned them into laborers. So those are the origins of our guerrillas in the first decades of the 20th century. The war is long. Then with the guerrillas, it took new forms in a moment of the Cold War, when guerrillas were forming in all of Latin America. And then later on, we added a new layer to that conflict in the 1980s with the beginnings of drug trafficking in Colombia, or the consolidation, because it began before, the consolidation of drug trafficking in Colombia. So mainly what happened was that new armed groups rose around the production and traffic of cocaine, mainly first marijuana, then cocaine. But also, the armed groups that we already had, the leftist guerrillas, also started participating in this traffic. It was an easy way for them to finance war in Colombia, so the guerrillas also joined the production of drugs. And then added to that, we had the formation in the 1980s of right-wing paramilitary groups, which are basically groups that were formed by the economic elites, who legitimized those groups as a way to defend themselves from the guerrillas, who were kidnapping, raising ransom among big industries, the big families of Colombia. So they started paying their own private armies to defend themselves. That was the claim initially, but later on it became evident that these paramilitary groups were not only a protective force, but were also being used to expand the interests of these economic elites in Colombia. For example, targeting union leaders and so on. So it's a multi-layered conflict. Oh, and I forgot to mention another very crucial element, and it's that the state has also been a significant perpetrator of human rights violations. So in the context of the Cold War, the national government started persecuting people on the left, intellectuals, students, union leaders. So Colombia is also a country where the state has forcibly disappeared people and so on. So it's a complicated war. So back to the peace agreements. Even though the peace agreements were praised internationally for targeting precisely these root causes of war in Colombia, there was an intense debate in Colombia around them, right? A large part of the population was not in agreement with the peace agreements, thinking mainly that the guerrillas needed to be defeated either militarily or that they should be cut no slack. They should be all sent to jail, while the transitional justice system that was set up in the peace agreements established a restorative justice model, right? Which basically what it did was, instead of privileging jail time for the demobilized guerrillas for the crimes they had committed, it privileged restorative measures with victimized communities. So, say, instead of sending somebody to jail for crimes against X community, they would discuss with the community what the community wanted as restoration. So, say, building roads, building schools, and so on. So, a large part of the Colombian citizenship was against this form of justice. The government decided to put up these agreements to legitimize them through a national plebiscite. And it was then that I came together with a group of other faculty and students at my campus. And what brought us together was a concern around the public debate that was going on around the plebiscite of the peace agreements. We saw, what we sensed in media and in our family conversations was that, on the one hand, the people who were against the peace agreements had a very ahistorical take on them, basically assuming that if we got rid of the FARC guerrillas instead of negotiating with them, there would be peace, right? And as historians, we know that this is not a matter of some evil people, right? That if we get rid of them, there will be peace. We thought, what's at stake is a tremendous opportunity of structural reform, but people aren't seeing this. And then on the other side, among the people who were in favor of the peace agreements, we found a lot of naivete, in the sense that a lot of people felt that, if the agreements passed, they were legalized, then there would be peace, right? As if all it took was to sign a paper and then we can move on. And very little awareness of what it took from each one of us to build a country where violence wouldn't repeat itself, right? It wasn't only a matter of them over there signing their peace agreement, but that should involve all of us. So what we decided to do was we started a research creation group called Historias para lo que viene, or Histories for what's to come. Our goal was to enrich the public debate around peace in Colombia from a historical perspective, thinking that if that public debate was poor in terms of history, it was in part our fault. As historians, we know a lot about the root causes of war in Colombia. But we've been saying this to ourselves, amongst ourselves, for decades, right? Well, the public keeps thinking that our war is the product of some evil people that we need to get rid of. So we decided to do something about this. We started Historias para lo que viene, and we did different things that I'll talk about in a moment, but I want to set up first some of the premises of this work. And this is the moment, the kind of moment in what I'll be sharing, where I hope you can connect with your own concerns. So we started this project based on the firm belief that building futures of social justice requires history, that social justice is not possible if we don't bring in a historical perspective. But what do I mean by that? This has different levels that we can think it through. And this is actually the result of, things I've been thinking about for the past 8 years. This wasn't clear to me at the beginning when I started doing this work. But, so on a first level, what does it mean that social justice requires history? On a first level, we need history for reckoning with what happened, right? History has come into processes of producing justice after pasts of atrocity through the basic right of justice, right? Victims, societies need to recognize what happened to victims, so one of the first efforts is to provide justice by clarifying the facts. So think about the Nuremberg tribunals, right? It's the justice that comes after atrocity to come up with a truth of what happened. Later on, or more recently, we've also been speaking about not only the right to justice, but the right to truth, right? Very importantly, a right moved forward by victims of human rights abuses in different parts of the world. Latin America here has been crucial in pushing the governments to recognize their responsibility in researching and coming up with facts that are recognized by society as a whole, right? That the abuses did happen, who perpetrated them, and who were the victims, and what were the conditions. So the result of this first level of history as a reckoning with what happened is what we see either in prosecutions of war criminals after war, or what the work that truth commissions do, right? Truth commissions that are set up to come up with a narrative accepted by everyone around the violent events. We have done that first step in Colombia extensively. Our government formed what's called the National Center for Historical Memory in the early 2000s as the result of another peace agreement with some right-wing paramilitary groups. And back then, in the early 2000s, the government accepted this responsibility of researching and making public the truth of war in Colombia. The National Center for Historical Memory has produced dozens and dozens of reports of different massacres, forced disappearances all over the country. That work is crucial. It's crucial because the first step is to recognize the horror that occurred. However, after 2 decades of this work, some critiques, very important critiques, have risen on the part of victims' organizations. On the one hand, victims' organizations are very critical of the fact that this kind of work of the historian researching the truth of the events tends to limit violence to the recent past, right? The questions we have asked on that first level are those of who pulled the trigger, when and where. And while that's important, it's not enough, right? Because for many of these communities, it is clear that violence comes from before, right? They've been saying years later that this had happened to them before, in conquest, in colonization, and later by the modern liberal state. It has not only been the armed actors. Also, another criticism that has written from victims associations is that it overlooks the not also, but tied to what I was saying before, it overlooks the material and symbolic violences of racism, classism, patriarchalism, and even liberal capitalism that operate during war, but also in periods of peace, also outside war. And finally, these narratives on that first level tend to reduce people to the category of victim, right? Turning them agencyless, right? They're only victims of this war that happened to them. So it papers over their historical struggles against structural violence. So again, that first level is crucial, but it's not enough, right? Now, on a second level, we need history for understanding the root causes of violence, right? They are tied to structural issues that include, of course, socioeconomic inequality that produces violence, but also cultural frameworks that guide our thinking about us and them, right? Who is valuable, who has historical agency, who is cared for, and who isn't, right? All are part of cultural and socioeconomic structures that live with us. So in order to lead to non-repetition, efforts of transformation need to mind those root causes, right? If we want conflict to actually stop and not replace one armed actor by the other. So, there's that second level. Now, in these first two levels, history sort of works as an outside force, right? History comes in to do the research, to look from the outside and determine the what happened, and then on the second level, the why it happened. But there's a third level, which is what's become the heart of the work that we've been doing in Colombia, in which history is relevant beyond those first two levels, and it's that history is crucial for political imagination towards change. So what do I mean by this? Political imagination requires historical thinking, right? If we are thinking about how to move forward, history is useful on different levels. One of them is we can look into the past if we are going to formulate a theory of how to move forward, we need to understand how change works. Right? And history is useful for that. Marx taught us that, right? You look into the past and you understand how societies change so that we can think about how to move forward. In that sense, what we had been doing before in steps 1 and 2 was we were only looking into the past to research human rights violations. But the past has so much more to offer, right? So one of the things that we've taken up doing is looking into the past not only to study war, but to study the many alternatives that the people who have been resisting this violence for generations have come up with, right? People have thought about other models, other possible modernities. And, they haven't, those efforts have not been triumphant, or our world would be different today, but it doesn't mean that there isn't something there useful for us in the present. All right, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on that, right? We target the three things, but this third moment in which history is about thinking towards the future also requires that we recognize that history is not outside like it is in the first two levels, right? The third level requires thinking that history is part of the struggle, right? That the production of historical knowledge doesn't happen outside of the conflicts of our societies, but are part of it. History, I'll develop that further in a moment. I don't want to get ahead of myself. All right. So we started this program, Historias para lo que viene, and we did different things. The first thing we did in the urgency that the plebiscite was coming and we needed to enrich this public debate somehow is we took our classes into public space. We started a program called Clase a la Calle, in which we invited faculty from history, but also from different departments, from the law school, from economics, from, you name it, anthropology, to bring their classes to public space when the topics that they were debating were relevant to this election that we had coming up. We advertised these classes on Facebook, and to our surprise, dozens of people showed up in the public squares, in the main square of Bogota, in front of the public library, and so on. So that became a very interesting space. We also held some history workshops in collaboration with the public library system. On Saturday afternoons, we discussed issues of the present, bringing historical primary sources for people to debate, discuss where did the issues that we face today come from, how did we get here? And again, we thought that, like 3 people might show up for our history workshops, and we would fill the auditorium. People were eager to discuss history and to, be able to discuss, have an environment where they could discuss what worried them in this very heavy political context that we were living. And finally, we took up a last initiative, which is the one that I've been working on for the past few years, around telling our stories differently. How can we produce history differently so that it can have impact in this presence that we are living in? So we started a program to produce historical research and storytelling enriched from the critical thinking that drove us as historians. What we've done is we've set up projects in which we always partner with community organizations, like what you just saw in the film before. In that case, it was with a community radio station and with a group of people victimized in the context of war in Colombia who had done work previously with that radio station. And so we always work with community partners and with storytellers, with communicators, because the truth is that as historians, we are rarely good at it. I'll speak for myself, I am not. Grad school turned me into, a machine of making arguments, solid arguments, yes, but arguments that nobody wants to read except for my peers. So, and if. So we've always been also partnering with people who know how to tell stories. When I started to reorient my practice as a historian to this kind of work, the first thing that I found was that I lacked the tools, right? Nothing in my training, I think things have changed, but 20 years ago, nothing in my undergraduate or graduate training gave me skills to work collaboratively, even less so with people working outside of academia. I had no skills around managing a project that involved more than one person, not to mention finding funding for it. So finding myself with all those lacks, I ended up here at Rutgers-Newark in 2017 as a visiting scholar at the Humanities Action Lab. For those of you who don't know, HAL brings together activists and academics to produce historically informed exhibits around pressing social issues of the present. So I spent a few months with them here learning, how did they raise their money, how did they put together this collaboration, what did engage work mean? That's a huge thing I have to thank HAL for. So that was fantastic. And during my time here, I also came to meet Julie Winokur and Tim Raphael from Nuanced Americans, and was very impressed by their work in producing storytelling about the immigrant experience in this area. So I was lucky enough to get them interested to come and work with me in Colombia. And the result of that was the Suba project that you just saw the film on. So I'm not going to go into that because you've heard that already. You've heard that story. I'm going to go into our most recent project. Can you go to the next one, please? Thank you. Our most recent project is this podcast called Nuestra Orilla, which we launched in 2023. The process started in 2020, so it took us over 3 years to produce this 8-episode podcast series with a new set of partners. This podcast series tells the story of the Bajo Atrato. It's a region located in the Colombian department of the Chocó, which is in the Pacific side of Colombia. It's predominantly inhabited by Black rural communities. And it has one of the lowest standards of living and highest levels of human rights violations in Colombia. A dense tropical forest, the region is extraordinarily biodiverse. And because of it, it's tremendously rich. Since the 16th century, it has been desired by different colonizing agents for the extraction of gold, cacao, rubber, wood, among others. The heavy presence of Black populations today is the result of the Spanish colonizers' introduction of enslaved labor for the gold mines, mainly in the 17th and 18th centuries. The history of resistance of those communities is long, from those who fled slavery early on and established palenques in the region, to the many others that reached freedom, not because our new constitutions in the national period granted them freedom, but through processes of self-manumission. Basically what people did is they paid themselves out from slavery by working on Sundays, the day that the Spanish crown allowed people to rest for God. People would work, keep working on the mines. And they bought their freedom to the point that when abolition was finally determined by law in 1852, it is considered that 98% of the Afro-descendant people in Colombia were already free. So no one granted them freedom, really. They won it. In the recent past, these communities have faced new violences, mainly from left-wing guerrillas who have come to their territory, mainly to produce cocaine, again, because this is a region where there's so little state presence. It's very easy for them there to produce the cocaine, and to traffic it. It's also a region very close to the Darien that connects the Pacific and the Caribbean. So it's a great route for both cocaine, arms for a country at war, and most recently for illegal immigrants trying to, well, I shouldn't say illegal, for immigrants trying to make their way to the United States. So what we do in the podcast, Nuestra Orilla, is that we follow the life story of its protagonist. Can you go to the next one, please? This is Ana Luisa Ramirez Flores, a woman and social leader who since age 12 joined local community organizations that challenge the cycles of violence her people have endured over time. Her story illuminates the interconnections between past and present forms of exclusion and inequality, examining the strategies that Ana Luisa and other protagonists of the story follow to combat injustice, to live with dignity in their land. our podcast does, so what we did was build our story around her life history, but really her story is the excuse to tell the story of the whole community. And again, not only in these days of her generation, but through her we weave the stories of women and men who came before her, and also the stories of the young people who are coming after, of the new leaderships that are rising in their territory. Our podcast challenges the conventional locations, timelines, and methodologies used to narrate Colombia's history of injustice and violence, moving beyond stories of victimhood and providing a longue-durée perspective that illuminates the roots of structural violence beyond the narratives of victims and perpetrators that they're usually tied in. So we have come to name this kind of work that we're doing reparative counter-histories, and I want to get a little bit into what do we mean by that, why, and I'm going to start with why reparative. Can I go to the next one, please? Okay. So let me start with the fact that, of course, history can be violent, right? It has legitimized domination, it has silenced voices and the historical agency, both through the archive, where it's difficult to hear voices of communities like this one, but also through the fiction of the archives that we're still trained to think should be, are the main repositories to produce historical knowledge, and also through notions of progressive linear time that assign to some human groups centrality in the processes of change, making them the driving force of the process, while leaving others behind and outside of it. This, of course, is tied to categories of modern, pre-modern, capitalist, pre-capitalist, political and pre-political, that are still there in our public debate and in some academic classrooms, right? Where communities like this one in the Bajo Atrato appear to be pre-capitalist or pre-modern in the best cases, and in the worst cases as if they were outside history, right? We expect them to be these repositories of authenticity, folkloric beings from time immemorial, but not part of history. So when I say that history can be violent, I mean both the narratives we tell, the stories, but also the discipline and its methodologies and underlying epistemologies. Now, by the same token, history can be reparative. So when I started doing this work, I framed it in terms, the language that I was using was the language of peace building, right? The goal, and that was framed also in the language that we were using in Colombia at the time, the goal was peace. But I've come to be critical of that perspective, mainly because that perspective remains within the liberal framework of progress, right? Which assumes that peace will come, right? Like, what is it that we need to do to turn the page and get into that future of peace? It assumes that there can be closure, that the contestation will end, that an egalitarian democracy within a liberal nation state as a framework can be attained. This perspective leaves untouched the structure, precisely. The system that produces the violences, both symbolic and material. I have found that the notion of reparations is more productive and coherent with the kind of work that we're trying to do. Very importantly, it is not a notion coming from above. It's not a notion coming from the institutional practice of transitional justice, but from below, from the social movements. The aspiration for reparations is that of non-repetition, right? That we can repair the world we live in by making it anew. And that requires structural change. So in line with Olufemi Tayewu, who was also mentioned before in one of the introductions, I understand reparations beyond financial compensation and symbolic redress. Rather, reparations implies transforming the patterns of distribution of advantages and disadvantages, material and symbolic, even patterns of distributing care, who we care for and who we don't. That started from the 16th century with global racial capitalism, and that continue active to our day. Now, this is not to claim that history can or will repair, right? There's no guarantee of the result. It is not a causal relation. It's not a progressive process. Anthropologist David Scott, Jamaican anthropologist David Scott, has raised the question of, can reparations even be? Right? His most recent book that he published this year is called Irreparable Evil. And he talks about how the harm, the evil perpetrated by slavery cannot be repaired, right? Which does not mean that we should stop trying to do something about it, right? So I'm using the term reparative in the sense of an intention, of setting an orientation for our work, a disposition, a provocation, and very importantly, a political one, right? Using history as part of the struggle and not as something that happens outside of it. And of course, I think it's never not important. I don't know what word I'm looking for. It's always good to remind ourselves, the little line in the bottom, the premise that history can never be neutral, right? That history, if it doesn't challenge the status quo, it's perpetuating it. And I say it, I don't think I need to say it in this setting, but I have presented my work in settings where I do get pushback from people who think that the work is too activist because I'm living outside the rigor of history. And this has happened to me in Austria, in public history conferences, so it's important to mention it. Okay. Now let me move to the notion of counter-history, which is the other one that we've been using to describe our work, reparative counter-histories. So this is a term that I draw from the work of Saidiya, Hartman, and then and from others as well. So what we're trying to do is to move from people's histories to counter-histories. What does this mean? Approaching history as reparations entails not only enriching the histories we tell with silenced voices, for example, but challenging history itself, right? It's not about including voices that were left out. It's about changing the framework because it's not about inclusion. It's about challenging history, questioning the violences of the archive, again, of our notions of linear progressive time, and also the violences of the meta-narratives that remain alive in a lot of our work, mainly that of the liberal nation state, right? And its promises of egalitarianism that mask the inequalities that keep going on underneath it. I'll illustrate that from the Colombian perspective, right? If we keep attached to the framework in which what's happening with our war is an aberration of the liberal nation state, then there's the presupposition that when we do have a proper liberal nation state, violence will stop. And what we hear from the communities that we work with is that for them it is clear that the violence is not an aberration of the nation state. It's inherent to it. It's a part of it, right? It's been a part of it from the beginning, from states that founded themselves on constitutions that claimed equality but maintained the institution of slavery. To begin with, also, not only in Latin America, right? So there's the importance of questioning those lines, or also in transitional justice apparatuses all around the world. The premise remains that we set up transitional justice apparatuses to reclaim national unity, as if, right, in national unity violence would stop. So we're not questioning that idea of the nation, right? What happens with immigrants, with the refugees today? They're outside that framework. So it's about questioning those frameworks from the very, very bottom. So in this sense, making counter-histories entails a narrative, a methodological, as well as an epistemological intervention. It is not only a matter of conceptualization and intellectual challenge, it supposes a practical challenge as well, and that's what I'm going to turn to now, to tell you a little bit about how is it that we go about doing this. Now, I'm going to share what we've done. It by no means means that I'm saying this is the way to do it. This is what we've experimented with. I'm sure there must be, I'm eager to learn more. We're actually starting a new process now, learning from things that we wish we had done better this time around. So this is just, like an example that hopefully we can discuss. Okay. So the main thing is that collaboration and co-creation have been our guiding principle in these research creation processes. The team members in this project, again included in the podcast project, included community partners, storytellers, and historians. So these are our two community partners, Ana Luisa Ramirez Flores, who I introduced briefly before, and Henry Serna Cordova on your right. Ana and Henry became social leaders when they were teenagers, and their communities were victims of a massive displacement in 1997, perpetrated by the Colombian army and right-wing paramilitary groups. So back then, their communities were in the process of negotiating collective titles of ownership of their land with the Colombian government. These are communities that have inhabited the Chocó for a century and a half, but they didn't have titles that proved that the land was theirs. But in the context of a law that passed in 1993 that they also pushed forward, they could claim to the Colombian state that as ethnic communities they had the right for collective titles. They were in the process of getting those titles when they were displaced from their territory. On the one hand, they had right-wing paramilitary groups coming into the area, intimidating the communities and accusing them of being collaborators of the guerrillas. So they were basically told that if they didn't leave their territory before the next day, they would all be killed. So people packed up what they could and they walked out. And at the same time that this was happening, the army bombed them. Bombs over these communities. Again, legitimized, the army claimed, because there was presence of the FARC guerrillas. Now, yes, there was presence of the FARC guerrillas in this territory. And yes, of course, there was a complicated relationship between the guerrillas and the communities, right? Because of different reasons. In Colombia, these left-wing guerrillas get to areas interested in producing cocaine, but they also come in with a very strong leftist discourse of equality. So people from the communities, young people from the communities often join because they are attracted by these discourses of equality. Others join because they give them jobs, right? They can have no job or work for them in the production of coca leaves. And others are forcibly recruited, right? It's not like you can tell them, no, I'm not going to work for you. So, because of all of these processes, of course, the communities had a complicated relationship with them. But still, to them, it was unbelievable that the army was bombing their communities, even if this is what was going on the ground. They had to leave. They went on to live as internally displaced people in a small town after walking for days through the jungle. And after living there for a year and a half, living on humanitarian aid, on plastic, living under plastic, they decided they had to go back to their territory because they knew full well that the reason for their displacement was that somebody else wanted that land that they were now getting the titles to. So even though war was ongoing on their territory, they decided to go back and they organized around this figure called the peace communities, Comunidades de Paz, which basically means that they claimed that they were not going to have any form of relationship with any of the armed actors, state, left-wing, right-wing, that the communities were outside that war and that they were just going back to reclaim their lands. They went back to a territory in war to make sure that they could save their territory, and sure enough, they found that their crops had been all turned down and now it was all planted with palm oil. So they've been there since then, and Ana and Henry have become social leaders. And as is the case in Colombia and in the world, social leaders, community leaders work around different issues, everything that their communities need. They work around women's rights, children malnutrition, the search for the disappeared. In this process of displacement, a lot of people were disappeared. And as a part of that process of leadership, Ana and Henry decided that they also needed to become storytellers of their territory. That part of their community work needed to involve them telling the stories of what was happening in their territories. And the reason, they have different reasons for this, but I want to mention three of them. The first one was that this was before I met them. They had already begun their road as to become storytellers. The first one was they were deeply concerned about how all the stories that came out of their territory of the Chocó were negative stories. They said the Chocó always appear in the national news as poor, war-torn territory, corrupt, malnutrition, all the bad things. And they said, yes, those bad things happen here, but other things happen here, right? Our communities are about other things as well, but we're always portrayed as the poor ones. Secondly, they were tired of extractive research, right? They said to me, journalists come here, scholars come here, they all want to know about the displacement and the displacement alone, because in their eyes, nothing else has ever happened here. They ask for our help to build the story, to go to talk to the right person. We need to interview the participants, who was there, who was like that. We take them, they leave, the story gets told elsewhere, and nothing stays here. We never get the story back. And this is connected to the third thing. They said, our children don't know what happened because the stories are told elsewhere. The people who lived through the displacement, a lot of them, the trauma is still alive. And the war, the armed actors are still there. So people are silent. So young people don't know about this. And their concern was, if the young people do not know what's happened here and what their communities have done to resist that violence over generations, our leaderships are going to die. Where, they are just thinking about fleeing the territory to look for jobs elsewhere. So they thought we need to tell our stories for our people to be able to remain here, for young people to keep defending our right to be here. So I met them, and there was a lot of resonance between what their project was, what it was that they wanted to do, and what we had been doing in Bogotá with Historias para lo que viene. Can we go to the next one, please? Now, on the communication side for this project, we partnered with a Colombian collective of documentarians and podcast producers called Colectiva Normal. Colectiva Normal is a team that includes a journalist, an anthropologist, a graphic designer, and a musician. And I came to know them because I listened to some of their podcasts, and I was taken with the way in which they produced very rich storytelling that was full of context, that didn't tell these stories of war in Colombia just as a problem of victims and perpetrators, but giving the audiences a wider picture. And also, very importantly, their productions all focused on participatory methodologies in which they trained communities, the community partners, in podcast production so that they can continue narrating their territories alone, independently. So we came together to start this project. And we approached co-creation not just as a method for including voices and stories that had been historically silenced, like the ones of these communities in the Chocó, but as a necessary step to undo the structural logics underpinning the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and knowledge. This means that our partners are not, we didn't bring them in as objects of study or as participants, but rather as co-researchers and co-producers in the project. The partnership started with project design and not later, and this is crucial. We didn't come in with a set project to ask them to be a part of it, but we sat down with them to think, okay, we have common interests. What kind of project do we want to build together? We decided together on the objectives, on what the target audiences would be for the podcast, what the products would be, how we would go about doing it, the process itself. We drafted grant applications together, budgets that of course always included compensation for the community partners. We established a collaboration agreement from the beginning, defining the responsibilities of each team member. And in a way we had two objectives with that agreement. One, that everyone knew what the responsibility was, but tied to each member of the groups, to our skills, right? Recognizing that all of the partners have knowledge that we are bringing into the project, right? It's not that the knowledge is the one, we the academics have the knowledge and you the community partners have the experience or but knowledge as well, right? So who is in charge of what? And also very importantly, we agreed to co-ownership of what we were producing. So we agreed that all sound material collected would be jointly owned, as well as our products, shared authorship over everything we made. So drawing from participatory action research and the colonizing perspective, our approach didn't only aim to generate a more democratic, inclusive, cooperative approach to social research, but to challenge the traditional hierarchies and distances between academia and communities, between us and them. Very importantly, the co-creation process also gave them control over what they wanted to tell us and how they wanted to tell it, including the voices, locations, the names to be included, and also those they preferred to keep silent. This was vital in a context in which the war is still ongoing, right? So they had the final word always as to what to include and what not. Again, in the sense of how did they want to represent themselves, but also because only they know what can be spoken out loud. I didn't mention this before, it's not only that the war is ongoing, but their territory today is ruled by the right-wing paramilitary groups that kicked them out, that today are called the Clan del Golfo. They rule the territory. So it's not like they can call the police if something happens. All right. So before I move from this one, I wanted to point in this picture. So we started doing this, Anna and Henry got training on how to use the equipment for the interviews and so on. And this photo that you're seeing here is their recording studio. So Rio Sucio is a town built on, they're mostly wooden houses over water because the river overflows. So, making a podcast in a place where houses are made of wood over water is difficult, especially because everyone is hearing reggaeton and whatnot. So they found that the only place where they could record and keep a relatively, a relatively silent place was the basement of the church. So that became so that's why you can see, all the chairs stored up, the deposit of the church was their office. All right, so another brief pause here. Around this project, care is everything, right? Care is everything, but also very importantly, something that we've had to keep in mind all along the way is that care can reproduce violence, right? So a big question for us has always been, how do we write and tell the history of power dynamics and power struggles without reproducing them in our own work? It's a constant work of critically looking at this, questioning our own place in these structures of violence, the ways in which we can reproduce them without even noticing, which of course takes building a trust relationship with the community partners in which they feel comfortable enough pointing out to the moments and ways in which it can get problematic, and it does. I talk here, I'll give you a brief example, but I talk here about, how we do everything together. Yes, we do, but there are moments in which the grant applications are written in English. So I write them, right? So it's something you have to be reminded all the time. Make sure to translate everything for them, to give them a chance to get back to me with, and go back into the grant application. Writing of scripts. When we started writing the scripts for the podcast, it became clear that they didn't want to write. And it took time and trust before they could tell me, I'm not going to write anything for you. I write terribly. So now, we set up a program because they want to write better, to be able to draft their own scripts for the podcast production. So we've set up a writing program for them to improve their skills and feel comfortable doing things like grant applications in Spanish and script writing. Okay. So as a team, we decided to tell, as I was saying before, to tell the story of this region through the life story of Anita, the main protagonist. We wanted to make sure that the story was not focusing on the violence, but we also knew that it was impossible not to mention it, right? We didn't want to make this story into one of, only resistance and political action, political action against what? You have to show that. But we made sure that that was not the guiding principle. So, for example, in the 8 episodes, we mentioned the displacement of 97, but that only comes up in the 5th episode. First, we lay the groundwork to explain this territory, these communities, how they got there, how they relate to their land, and we make sure to go about explaining the structural violence that goes on here. Why is it so difficult for people here to get educated, for example, is this topic of one of the episodes. And then, only then, we get into the violence of 1997. Oral history, of course, was at the core of the process. It was not merely included as a methodology to give voice to the oppressed. It was for us a crucial way to incorporate the Black knowledge and history of these communities, which is central to our decolonial approach. The process started with a series of life history interviews that we did with Ana Luisa. We paired that with an extensive literature review of academic work done about this region. And then we went about defining with the community partners which would be the other voices that we wanted to include, what other people in the community we needed to talk to. We used a tool that I want to show you quickly. We started building a storyboard for the podcast before going on to do all the interviews. And we used this platform called Miro. It's just a very basic board where you can paste things. But the great thing is that everyone can access it for teamwork. So we kept it alive so that community partners and academics and communicators could constantly be moving things around, adding things, and that was tremendously useful. Go ahead, thank you. As we started working on the scripts, we had a better sense of the additional voices and records that we needed, both contemporary and historical. So for example, we researched the narratives about this region from the 16th century on, because we wanted, on our first episode, we tackle the prejudice around this area, how it's always portrayed like our community partners wanted to step away from, right, as poor, violent, corrupt. So we thought, okay, this isn't something of today alone. These narratives are so pervasive because they've been around for centuries, right? They're deep in us. So where do they come from? So we went about researching what the first Spanish cronistas said about this region in the 16th century, all the way up to explorers who traveled around the area in the 19th century, exploring for ways for the interoceanic canal to what is today the Panama Canal, to politicians in the 20th century, to contemporary journalistic approaches. So this meant doing research in archives, newspapers, we searched maps, historical maps of the region, music archives, because of course if you're building a podcast, the audio part is crucial. So we did a lot of research to try to find historical records of music from this region, for example, news about this region also in the radio archives. And we also produced music for the podcast, music that comes from the regional genres. I want to make a point about the interviews, and it's that our community partners, they went ahead, they took care of all of the oral history interviewing, of course, but over time they discussed this with us and they said to us that they didn't like to call them interviews. And that was really illuminating to me, because they said, when you think about an interview, you're thinking you're getting something from somebody. You're coming in with your recorder to get something. And they constantly told us, first, we're not taking something. This belongs to the community, right? They're not an outside researcher doing it. But more importantly, they would say to us, we come in to have conversations with people. And when we come in, we're usually doing our community work that they keep doing, talking to people about, how's your grandmother doing? Were you able to secure that visit to the doctor for her? And then this comes up. This part of the work is not something that's outside, parallel to the work that they do with the communities, but it's part of it. So they insisted on calling it conversations. We also made a point to interview not only the elders, but also the young. And again, in this sense of that these histories are not for, to record what happened, but how is this meaningful for the people who are coming forward. Our last episode is called Los Renacientes, the reborn. That's a word they use there in the region to refer to young people, and it's the same word they use for plantain trees. A new tree comes out from an old tree, and that is called a renaciente. So they give the same name to young people, who are the ones taking, that path forward. So we focus there on them and their hopes for the future and their connections with the past, and their, it's both about expectations, but also about belonging to a community. So that's one of the ways in which we try to move between past and present. One last thing I want to mention is that as a historian, when I went in, I thought that, we're researching the history of this territory. Of course, the first thing that I thought about was the papers. Where are the papers? Are there any papers? There weren't any papers. There's barely any written archive in the region. So, okay, of course, we'll go to the oral histories. We can do that, right? We can talk to people and whatnot. We started doing that, but I realized over time that constantly people kept referring me to, when I asked for history, people would refer me to the river or the tree that is I don't know where. Like, no, profe, you have to come and see this tree, we have to go to that river. And I do it, part of the ethnographic work, but it took me a while to understand that what people were telling me was that for them, history is not only in the memories and in the testimony of the words, but is there in the land. And this has to do, the best way I found to understand this is they have cultural practices like the obligamiento, which basically is that when a baby is born, the umbilical cord is planted in a tree. and that person has a connection to that tree for life. So when they're talking about their past, they were usually referring me to the tree here and there, and then, it took me a while to understand that that's the tree where the belly button of I don't know what leader in the past was. So to understand that, I had to go to the tree, right? I think I barely understand this, but at least, it got to me that this history that we are producing escapes me. It comes to a point where I don't get it anymore because it's theirs as well, right? And I'm not fully understanding, but that's okay, right? That's okay. We're all learning. Okay, so I'm reaching my conclusion now. Besides the podcast, we also produced a website that I want to show you briefly. Go ahead, one more, please. We produced a website that, more than only being a repository for the podcast, is an expanded podcast. So in the website, the website is bilingual, but the podcast is only in Spanish. But there you can find the episodes, but if you click on them, you can also see extra materials. We've included there for each of the episodes maps, soundscapes, photos, bibliography, so that people can go deeper into the story that we're telling. We also produced a listening methodology that has 3 components. One of them is in the website, which are lesson plans. We thought that we wanted a listening methodology for children, so we worked with 2 school teachers to produce curriculum so that children in their social science class, in Spanish class, and there's a class in Colombia called Ethics and Democracy, can learn these subjects through this podcast, right? So learning Colombian history by listening to these voices, as opposed to what we usually learn, which are, like the big men who signed the Constitution and whatnot. So we did that as a listening methodology. We also did workshops with community radio stations. I forgot to mention this, but the reason why we are producing podcasts is that in Colombia, radio is the media that gets everywhere. So if you do a digital project, you're stuck with urban audiences alone. While working with a podcast allows us to target the urban audiences through podcast form, but also using the community radio stations to get to the communities whose voices we are trying to honor here. So we worked with 6 community radio stations in the Chocó. We did workshops with them in which they listened to the podcast and came up with programming to accompany the broadcasting of the program to produce local conversations around their histories. And finally, we did a series of listening gatherings with communities. The communities that Anna and Henry come from, they live in tiny communities scattered in rivers that feed the Atrato River. Many of these communities have no access to electricity, much less internet. So Anna and Henry basically traveled with a speaker, to these communities, and at night they would play it and have the whole community be present, ask questions, and participate. Okay. I want to leave with an idea, and with an idea of what it is like to make history, to practice history making, not as closure, but as struggle. Using history not to conclude, not to argue, or even to convince, but more to evoke and provoke. The narrative we produced sought to weave, to connect on different levels, to connect the individual and the collective, to highlight how past, present, and future are far from distinct boxes, but actually overlap. We sought to draw connections between present and past forms of violence and exclusion, to embody that the past is not past, to highlight the multiple colonialisms at play, how they don't disappear, but rather fold into one another. We sought to show how violence has been part and parcel of the process of state formation, and not only an aberration of it, expressed in recent human rights violations. We also sought to trace connections between the story's past and the future that is being forged in the now, and that also lives in our expectations and in our hopes. It's a story that moves between the here and the there. I didn't mention this, but the podcast is called Nuestra Orilla, which means like our side of the riverbank. And we chose that, on full purpose, as a connecting metaphor of, this is about our riverbank and yours. It moves between oppression and persistence, between the power of words and the power of aesthetics with sound, and between inviting the audience, we hope, not only to reflect, but also to feel. The result is a story that's full of sediments, that's reinscribed, that doesn't aspire to closure, to unity, or to turn the page, but aspires to be part of an ongoing contentious struggle. That's it, thank you. I don't know how we're doing on time, I hope.
Thank you so much, Catalina, for sharing your work with us and for teaching us how to do this kind of work. The floor is open for questions. Raise your hand and I'll go around with the microphone.
Thank you so much for that. It's a really fascinating project and just makes my imagination go in a lot of different directions. But I'm curious about the storytelling aspect that you presented for both of the projects, the kind of history to come and our side of the river, especially kind of as someone who's trained and has the baggage of an academic who's preoccupied with the form of making a proper argument. I'm curious about your process for learning other modes of storytelling. I'm really interested in form, right? So how do you think about the form of a story, and how do you really kind of start to practice doing your work that use these different forms? I think that more and more people are starting to think about this as a relevant question for people doing research and scholarship, but yeah, I want to get in the nitty-gritty of the actual work of wrestling all this information into narrative.
Thank you. Should I go one by one, Maite? Yeah. Yeah? I think so. Yeah, okay, good. That's a great question. And I mean, the first thing I want to say is just very humbly, I don't know, I mean, I think of course it's changed my take on it, but what I've learned from this is that it's all about the collaboration. I cannot claim that I've become an amazing storyteller. I've learned about it, but I partner with people who know about this, right? I think at the beginning, I thought that I had to learn to do everything, right? And now I know that, I mean, there's no way. So I've actually become more aware of what I do not know how to do. So, I mean, I will say that. When we started, for example, writing the scripts, as an academic historian, I was convinced that meaning was going to be transmitted through the words that we were writing, right? So I thought that my challenge was to write in a different genre, right? Like, how do I write for, thinking about this audience and, like, in a different way. And while there was, I actually didn't write the scripts. I was constantly editing, but in our partners who are the podcast producers was the script writer, right? And then we had an editor, a journalist, who would read what he wrote, I edited, and then it went to our editor, the journalist, and she was like, you have to make this like a third of what it is. Boring. That was her all the time, boring. Right? So, I'm just like, okay, I am boring. I don't know how to get out of that. But what I did learn was that the meaning was not going out only through the words, right? And for example, in the stage of the process, when the music design came in, I started learning a lot about like the magic that happens in that moment. So for example, we had a scene in talking about the displacement, right? And we put a lot of effort in the words to not make it a victimizing thing, right? But to show the struggle of these people, how they went about all these obstacles and whatnot. And then the musician went in, and if the musician used sad music, victimizing instantly. Doesn't matter what we had written, right? So I learned, for example, that the music is everything. So in many moments, way more powerful than what we were saying with words. Yeah. So yes, I cannot claim, I think, to me, I cannot do this without my team of people, because there's no way. Let's not even talk about the editing, right? I have no idea. The editing of sound, right? I can edit words all you want, but editing of sound, Now I think the challenge I'm facing is that at first I didn't want to write about, not that I didn't want to, but I wasn't sure how to write about this, right? And I felt that because this was a collective process, I couldn't, like, how am I going to write about the experience of of this group of people? Now I've come to understand that I do have to write because it's important for audiences like my students, but it's the challenge of how do I write about this, where I find that my genre of writing as an academic is not enough, not good enough to transmit this. But again, not solved yet. It's the challenge.
Thank you. I really appreciate this as a Colombian. I think it's amazing that you can bring your work here so people can understand better the situation there. It would be awesome if you do this with some Colombian groups that still don't understand it, living in here, right? Is this work still going on?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. We're moving on to new projects with other communities. So we're starting one in, it's sort of close to this region, further north in the Darién. We're starting a new process.
Mm-hmm. The second question is how, I'm not sure how to do this question, but do you have support on this kind of work, and I'm guessing, with the current government? Because we know that there's a lot of opposition for building peace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely a good moment for this work to be out with the current government. We haven't gotten much support just because, I think government is still government. We were very optimistic. So for those of you who don't know, Colombia has, for the first time ever, a left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, who's been in office for 2 years. And we were very optimistic that we would be able, for example, to get our curriculum to the schools. But it's a bunker. Like we have not been able to get to the right people in the Ministry of Education to get it out. It's politics as usual. They are giving a lot of resources out for cultural programs, we could call them. And I've had some of my community partners have been applying to government monies to continue with this kind of work. So that's been the positive side of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one comment for people is that this placement that she's talking about is one of the cause roots of the migration that we have here, not just from Colombia, but from Central and South America and around the world because of the violence and taking the land and resources from natives. Okay, thank you.
So I have a question, and it is like, how will Historias para lo que viene, like a workshop of Historias para lo que viene, will look like for elite victims, right? So, like as I've seen in the video, like in the workshop that you did in Suba, like I am assuming, it's an assumption, that those victims were mostly like peasants, vulnerable communities because of the drawings they were making. So yes, I'm very curious on how that a workshop on the Colombian elites will look like. Like how to create that consciousness, that historical consciousness of the only way to reach peace is by creating it, right? Because again, like as you previously mentioned, the perspective of these elites is that the only way to get peace is by defeating the guerrillas. And I know how it works because I grew up with that speech, which I don't agree on, right? And I know like they're very close to that idea that the only way to get peace is just that killing everyone, like killing the militias, killing the elite, and that's very unfortunate, right? So how to create that peace consciousness of construction, right? Like reconstruct peace in that type, in that population group.
Yeah, thank you. That's a tough one. It's, you know, like here in the United States, it's very polarized, right? It's practically impossible to get, you know, your message across to someone who's already so convinced of what they think that they don't want to listen. So, you know, when we started this project, I think that was our target, right? Like, how do we convince that other side, the people who voted against the peace agreements? And I think I've given up on that, sadly. I mean, I'll explain to what extent. I think some people I'm just not going to convince, so I'm not speaking to them. So when I say that this work is about making history part of the struggle, I'm thinking more of how this is useful for the communities who are struggling for peace, like the communities I work with. How this is useful for them, for the leadership of the younger generations and so on, right? How do we work to enrich the political debate in Colombia, to give people elements in that struggle, rather than convincing, you know? I think that's the road to change. It's not convincing the right-wingers.
Any other questions? Hello, my name is Hillary. First, I just want to thank you for giving this keynote address. It was wonderful. I was especially interested in Colectiva Normal and in what you had talked about, how the organizations who are involved with these communities equip these communities to do the podcasting work and to engage in that co-creation, collaboration. I wanted to know if you had any insight into how they were able to do that, like what the process for that looked like in helping and teaching these communities how to work with the materials and with storytelling, and what the community reaction for that was, right? Like, how did the community react to folks teaching them and to having access to do storytelling in this type of way?
Yeah, and no, they are amazing. What they do is they do workshops with the communities to teach them every step of podcast production, right? From designing your project, how do you go about doing interviews, how do you use the recorders, you know, editing and so on. They've also published booklets explaining the process, so that people who have not gone through their workshops can use the booklets and start their own processes. And the reception in the communities is amazing. I didn't mention this in my talk, but Ana and Henry, who we worked with for Nuestra Orilla, one of the things that resulted from making the podcast is that they started a local, they call it a school for leadership and communications. And they are currently training 15 young Black and Indigenous people in the region on what they learned through this process. And of course, you know, like the young people, I mean, it's great because just think about this. We usually think from Bogota. You think about these communities, again, as authentic, right? They have nothing to do with technology, but to see, they're super interested in learning how to work out the recorders, how to put their stories to circulate on social media and whatnot. So, you know, I think I had one of those pictures of the young people who are interviewing each other. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
There, thank you.
So we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I was going to ask mainly the same thing. I was curious about how the people from the community, besides your partners, have reacted when they listen to the podcast. Do you have any kind of feedback, like of just the normal people who listen to them? What do they think about it?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think I was part of a workshop there in Rio Sucio after the podcast came out, with some people who had participated giving their testimony, being interviewed for the podcast, and others who weren't. And what was interesting to me is also how you put this story out and it has unexpected effects, right? That were not it was not what I had in mind, but it's what the community needs and good for them. It's great. So, you know, I'll tell you one, for example. There's this woman who went to the event and she basically, what she shared, she had listened to the podcast and she was interviewed for one of the episodes. And she said, well, when they first came to talk to me, I thought, why are they doing this? Why do they want us to talk? They're going to get everyone in danger. This is going to be a problem. So she wasn't sure if she wanted to participate until she said, well, maybe I'll talk just because I've never talked about this. This is a community that it's not only that they were displaced. A lot of these people lost family members in the displacement because people died or disappeared, and they haven't talked about it, and they haven't received any psychological help afterwards. So this woman decided to participate because she thought, this may be, like at least therapeutic in some way. I'll talk. And then she was saying about what it meant to her to have spoken, and how empowered she now felt, that she felt that every young person in their community needs to know what's happening. We need to inspire more people to talk. This, changed me to have put this outside of my system. I never thought about this as anything. I don't know anything about the trauma behind. It's not my field. So there's the unexpected results that come out, and then the ones that are closer to what we do intend. To me, it's been powerful, for example, to listen to young kids from the area who are very excited to say, they contrast what they listen in the podcast to the history they are taught in school. And they are excited about this. They're excited to see that history, that their community has been part of history, that history is not only what's happening in the books. So I've seen that response as well, which is closer to what we were aspiring to.
Thank you once again for this marvelous teaching. Thanks to all of you for being here. Catalina Muñoz is going to be with us again in a few minutes, so I encourage you all to stay for a really interesting conversation, but this concludes this part of the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
We're starting.
Okay, so good afternoon again. It is my real pleasure to introduce the moderator for our conversation, our keynote conversation this afternoon. Her name is Liz Sevchenko, and she is the founder and co-director of the Humanities Action Lab, a growing coalition of over 30 universities, issue organizations and public spaces led from here, from Rutgers University, Newark, that collaborate to develop student and community curated public memory projects around contested social issues. HAL's latest project is Climates of Inequality, Stories of Environmental Justice, a traveling exhibit, web platform, and public action confronting histories of environmental racism and their legacies for climate crisis. Created by over 500 students and frontline community leaders across the hemisphere. Previous projects included States of Incarceration and National Dialogue on Local Histories, which inspired the Rikers Public Memory Project, a collaboration with Freedom Agenda and Creative Forward, and the Guantanamo Public Memory Project, an international collaboration of universities and organizations. Sevchenko launched from Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. She is the founding director of the International Coalition of States of Conscience, a network of historic sites that foster public dialogue on pressing contemporary issues, and she served as vice president for programs at Lower East Side Tenement Museum. She received her BA in history from Yale University and her MA in history from NYU. In 2017, she was awarded the Rome Prize to write public memory for a post-truth era, fighting denial through memory movements, that came out with Routledge in 2022. And I leave you all with our moderator, Liz Sevchenko. City. Oh, actually, we do have one. So you each get a mic. Thank you.
Okay, everybody got their coffee and such. Everybody bundling up because it's really cold in here. No? Well, thanks for staying. I am so happy, and I know you will be too, to have the opportunity to talk with these two particular people today, and I'm going to weave their introductions in with just sort of explaining how this is going to go, so listen carefully because you'll find really interesting things about them along the way. So these are two people that just at this particular moment, this particular week, I think are just really amazing resources and inspiration for both of us. One of them is somebody whose work I have long admired and has been a huge influence on my work, and that is Catalina Muñoz, who you have, most of you I think met already, Associate Professor of History at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, and one who I just learned of through this event, and I know is going to shape my thinking and my work for years to come, and that is Gary Wilder, who's Professor of Anthropology, History, and French, and Director of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change at the CUNY Grad Center. And the reason I'm so happy to be talking to them this week and this moment is that they've both dedicated in really different ways, but dedicated their work and their lives to reimagining history and kind of rethinking where we can find hope. And that is something that I'm really grappling with this week and sort of having conflicting ways of understanding this moment that we're in and all the people that I've been talking to about it. Because since Tuesday, there's just a lot of questions about time and history and where everything that we're experiencing fits in. You know, is this a new apocalypse that since the election we're entering into a new historical era where, you know, MAGA-controlled 3 branches of government are going to have real material policy implications, violent impacts on the people we care about, and you know, a transformation of land and society for generations to come? Or is this week like all the other weeks that came before it? Because you know, we're still the country we went to sleep in on Tuesday night is the same country we woke up in on Wednesday morning. One that is, you know, founded on global racial capitalism, celebrates white supremacy, and where 52% of white women voted for Donald Trump. That was true before. Everybody was the same, and they just voted. That's all they do. Nothing sort of really changed. Or is this a return to a sort of, or a regression to another kind of moment in history where, you know, it's a sort of 19th century resurgence or version of reassertion of patriarchy and white supremacy, you know, great again, a turning backwards. And I think what I'm so eager to hear more about in this conversation is that both Gary and Kata would tell us that those are all the wrong questions, and that none of those are explain the experience that we're having or how we should be thinking about it, because they both really exploded kind of linear ideas of history and challenged the divisions between past, present, and future that all of those kind of explanations or anxieties suggest, and instead have, as you heard from Kata earlier, talked about and really understand how the past pervades the present and is always at work in shaping what comes next. So I won't tell you or reference so much, except for Gary's sake, about Kata's dedication to thinking differently about time and teaching about history. I loved your last quote that I hadn't heard you use before, of history as struggle, not closure. And I'll just say for Gary's sake, in the context of the Columbian Truth Commission, we all heard about the kind of versions of a kind of narrow definition of the history of the conflict that the sort of lawyers and people who are engaged in some of the formal peace processes were promoting, and instead looking at the sort of longue durée and long life histories of people who were not considered the central actors in that story. And I know we're all really inspired by that work. And then for those of you who don't know Dr. Wilder, his most recent challenge to these traditional ideas of time and history come through this amazing book that I just read for this event called Concrete Utopianism, The Politics of Temporality and Solidarity. But as some of you know, he comes to this, particular argument through decades of work on the French Empire, Francophone West Africa and the Caribbean, Black Atlantic social thought, where he looks at the intersection of historical anthropology, intellectual history, and critical theory, with a special emphasis on Marxism, post-colonialism, and post-structuralism. So, you know, in this book, and I hope he'll talk more about it, he really challenges the kind of linear, determining view of history in the mainstream left, which in the name of either realism or pessimism dismisses and sort of forecloses possibilities that can be found in all of the times that are sort of flowing through us. So I hope you'll be as inspired as I was by his embrace of the possible impossible, and as he writes, practices of anticipation that envision and enact, call for and call forth seemingly impossible ways of being together. So I'm going to start by inviting Gary to share in a short kind of presentation what he was trying to do with his vision of history in this book when he began, and maybe reflect a little on what it can do in the current moment. And then, since you've heard a lot from Dr. Muñoz, I'll then pose questions to both of them that they can talk about together. And the question, in addition to just sort of the one that I suggested about sort of any changes in your own work that I'll pose, because is about how both of you call into question how, where, and with whom to engage your ideas of historical time. So, we heard a lot about this, Catalina's incredible commitment to kind of public history as prefigurative politics, and all the ways that the manner in which people are engaging with history is critical for establishing the experience and the relationships that we want to have with each other. And similarly, I know that Gary has thought a lot about connecting theory and practice, and the ways that we have to inhabit what we want to imagine and imagine what we want to inhabit. And I'll just, the last question or subject that we'll talk about all together is how all of this relates to a seminar and a set of days around reparations. Since this is a movement that itself kind of contests divisions between past, present, and future, it's about how the past is still with us, and beyond sort of legacies, it's about the ways that these structures are renewed and need to be kind of undone. We'll sort of, the last question for both of you will be about how your visions of reparations. We heard a little bit about your vision of reparative history and what that means. So the last thing I'll say before I pass it off to Gary is that I just met Gary today, but I can see through his work, and also knowing Kata, that both of them really come to their work from a place of kind of real love for the people that they're engaging with, and a kind of celebration of the imagination and brilliance of the people who can bring forth the possibilities that they're hoping for. And so I just hope you feel that, and I hope that really comes through. So I will ask Gary to kick it off. You can do it from your seat. You don't even have to get up.
Perfect. Does that work? Thank you so much, Liz and Carolina and Maria and Ashley. It's wonderful to be here. I work at CUNY Graduate Center, so CUNY and Rutgers are kindredly spirited public universities, and right in the urban core, so it's terrific to be here. Maria did suggest that it would be useful for me to say a few introductory remarks about my book, Concrete Utopianism. We can definitely talk more specifically about time and history in our discussion. I'll mention that a little bit here, but I'm going to give you a little bit, it's not a book that can be summarized. There's no summary of it. There are a lot of moving parts, but I'll give you some of the spirit that went into the making of it and what the intervention is supposed to be. So that book, Concrete Utopianism, proceeds from a simple starting point. Starting point is this: there is only one world, characterized by entanglement, interdependence, and asymmetry, or unevenness. The oneness of our world poses a fundamental dilemma for emancipatory politics. Such politics must, as ever, be oriented toward collective self-management, grounded in social equality, whose aim is human flourishing. In other words, this must be a local affair concerning specific socio-political communities, however we define said community. Yet, as we all know, we live in a world of global interdependencies, such that anonymous processes and faraway actors shape the life chances of any given people. Situated communities, no matter how democratic and egalitarian, simply do not, under these conditions, have the capacity to make choices or formulate policies that can ground collective well-being and human flourishing within their communities. This, to me, means that emancipatory politics require translocal vision and practices and forms which call for transversal alignments, identifications, and forms of association that cut across seemingly self-evident boundaries between regions, cultures, ideologies, and interests. In other words, if we want a left politics adequate to our times, we need to fashion new ways of relating autonomy and interdependence, democracy and internationalism, singularity and solidarity. Following Marx, this means thinking dialectically, being attuned to the way alternative possibilities may already dwell within existing arrangements. But it may also require the paradoxical capacity, as Marx also instructed, to draw our revolutionary poetry from the future. This, of course, in a certain way is an impossible task. If forms of thinking are grounded in and overdetermined by social arrangements within a given historical situation, on what grounds could we possibly think otherwise when the language, concepts, references, and context for doing so simply do not yet exist? Nevertheless, as any of us engaged in critical thinking or political work know, this impossible task is unavoidable, or should be unavoidable. Conversely, concrete utopianism may mean recognizing, reactivating, and reworking traces of less alienated forms of life or unrealized possibilities that may persist within our present, especially if we understand the present as a non-synchronous now, a non-identical now. Each of these three operations, immanent critique, drawing poetry from the future, and reactivating vital energies crystallized within an untimely now, each of these refuses to conflate immediate appearances with the really real. They do not mistake what is given for what might be possible. In other words, each requires us to unthink supposedly self-evident boundaries between here and there, us and them, now and then. So in the spirit of Freud's uncanny and Du Bois's double consciousness and Benjamin's concept of awakening, to me, this means recognizing the familiar as strange and the strange as familiar. That old simple operation has great subversive possibility packed within it, but it may also mean making the familiar strange and making the strange familiar. Such operations allow us to see how seemingly stable objects of historical study may differ from themselves, or what they appear to be, and how seemingly disparate objects of study may already be entwined with one another. This, then, is the work of what I call concrete utopianism. Traditional, idealist, abstract utopianism, as we know, engages in ungrounded speculation about perfect societies. In contrast, as I'm imagining it, concrete utopianism identifies plausible links, actual pathways between given arrangements and other possible worlds supposed to be impossible. It makes concrete utopianism makes circumscribed demands that are not plausible under given arrangements. Concrete utopianism makes circumscribed demands that are not implausible, that are quite, far out, but not unthinkable, not impossible, within reach under given arrangements, but whose logic and implications, if followed far enough, are incompatible with existing arrangements and might help explode the existing order. This, I believe, is what Ruth Wilson Gilmore, borrowing from Andre Gortz, means by non-reformist reforms. We can think here of prison and police abolition, the elimination of fossil fuels, global South debt cancellation, right? Not impossible to think about some kind of coalition that would cancel global South debt, reparations for Atlantic slavery, or the abolition of inherited wealth. There are many more examples I'm sure we can all think of non-reformist reforms. Note my processual emphasis on utopianism. This is not about static plans or ready-made formulas, nor is it a matter of reifying normative models that may be applied to all times and places. Rather, as I understand it, concrete utopianism signals an intellectual and practical orientation, a visionary and experimental way of seeing and knowing and doing, attuned to what, under existing arrangements, appears to be, or is said to be, impossible. This is why I link concrete utopianism to what Henri Lefebvre calls the politics of the possible impossible. Concrete utopianism, as I think you guys talked about in the last session, also entails prefigurative acts of anticipation, acting as if the impossible future were already at hand. As Liz cited, it's a calling for that is a calling forth. But here's a paradox. If our world historical conjuncture, as I'm arguing, calls for this kind of political orientation, 50 years of neoliberal counter-revolution, converging with 50 years of a certain kind of influential critical theory, has profoundly undermined our capacity to even think, let alone act along these lines. So this is the perspective from which, in my book, I critique what I call left culturalism, left presentism, and left realism. I can say more about those in the discussion, if need be. Here I'll just say that such thinking, this presentism, this culturalism, this realism, offers self-identical notions of here, now, and us, provincial notions of place, punctual notions of time, and ontological notions of subjectivity. Such thinking typically reduces utopianism to idealism, romanticism to conservatism, and Marxism to liberalism. It mistakes poetic vision for prescriptive blueprints. This difference, this distinction between vision and blueprint is something I think we need to hang on to. And this thinking tends to equate pessimism with radicalism. I would argue that there is a perverse complicity between such fatalism and neoliberal triumphalism. Both tend to make ungrounded metaphysical assertions about the end of history. I thus regard liberal optimism and categorical pessimism as two sides of the same anti-political coin. Both leave existing arrangements undisturbed. Ironically, the global right has employed utopian political imagination in the service of fundamental societal transformation. Reactionary forces, as we know this week, Liz, all of us, have offered powerful visions of a world they wish to see in order to mobilize broad coalitions across evident differences so as to remake history. In horrifying ways, we have seen the supposedly impossible become everyday reality. Said differently, the global right has triumphed partly by following the very pathways that influential currents of post-structuralism and post-colonialism have told us were dangerously outmoded or simply impossible. So this is the perspective from which I call for left thinking to pay renewed attention to solidarity and temporality, to critical internationalism and concrete utopianism, to dialectical reversals and aesthetic politics, to immanent critique and what Aimé Césaire called poetic knowledge. This is why I am so taken with Lenin's revolutionary call to transform the imperial war into a civil war, which for our times I take to mean that in any given situation, the crucial axes of actual division and possible alignment are not self-evident. They cannot be known a priori. They must be discovered and constructed in ways that cut across common sense, territorial, social, cultural, or ideological divisions. This is why I find it so useful at this moment, anachronistic as it may seem, to recall Samir Amin's, the great Egyptian political economist Samir Amin's bold, if imperfect, call for a fifth international, or what he called a new internationalism of peoples. Just because the prospect of such an internationalism, let alone an international form of democratic socialism, is so remote, and it is indeed remote, does not make the stakes any less high or the struggle any less imperative. On the contrary, it seems clear that it has never been more important, it has never been more clear that humanity is hurtling toward collective self-annihilation as we systemically destroy the very matrices of natural and social reproduction. Throughout this book, I argue, therefore, that the opposite of pessimism is not optimism, but the opposite of pessimism is concrete utopianism. I thus try to develop a forceful critique of a pessimist metaphysics that leads to a melancholy fatalism and a leftist defeatism. But this is very different from being optimistic that things will work out. It's simply an argument against the increasingly prevalent belief that it is somehow brave or radical to declare and conclude that things certainly will not work out. The great Venezuelan anthropologist Fernando Coronil reminded us that while the contemporary left has no map, it still has a compass. Why, I ask in this book, has so much of the academic left lost the will or capacity to use that compass? I'll stop. Sorry, we can be conversational. That was a little formal, but now you know where I stand.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think what I'll do is just kind of invite Kata to respond to anything that came up for you. But the question that I wanted, so if that weaves in, please do. But the question I wanted to kind of ask both of you was how your thinking, whatever the thinking and the intentions were that your work began with that you've described to us, like how has that changed since the start of it? And either, it's sort of what are you really attached to or finding inspiration in this current moment? So that could be that like the world has changed and you're applying your work differently, or that your own work and thinking has changed. So sort of what's your own historical trajectory?
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Intentions changing. A lot. I think I talked about that a little bit when I was presenting. I think for me, when I started doing, I don't want to start doing this work. When I was presenting, I was talking about the context of the peace agreements in Colombia, but I think that's not. It's. I think I've been a publicly facing historian always. Just frustrated with I produce this, no one's going to read it. What does one do with this? A, yeah. And then B, coming from Colombia, in my context, is like I cannot just be sitting in an office producing things for other academics. The world is ending outside my door. How can I just be in here doing this? But yes, the intentions have changed a lot, and I will stick this to a small example. Manuela was asking me before about convincing. How does one convince? The right way in the Colombian case, yes. And I think at the beginning when I started doing this work around peace, I thought that was the goal. How do I convince these people who don't seem to see what I see, right? How do we use history to convince them? But I think that has changed dramatically for me. I think there's no convincing to be done there. It's more about how can my work fuel and be nourished also by the politics of the people who are doing the work on the ground. And how do we remake history? Because if we keep thinking that history is about convincing somebody else, we keep thinking that we're standing in a place where this is the us. I know you don't know. I'm going to enlighten you. But it's more about what history is. What's up for grabs? How do we see the world? Is what we are fighting over, right? And that fight isn't won by convincing somebody, but by nourishing the debate, right? And also by learning from the people who have been doing this struggle for way longer than I'm just waking up to this struggle. But how's this struggle being fought out there? And what can we learn? How can we remake the ways in which we do this in academia? If we get into the struggle and not keep pretending we're outside of it. So I'm really glad I started there.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. Have you had? Even in the preface to Concrete Utopias, you sort of admit that you wrote a lot of it in one period, and then the pandemic hit, and it put a whole other context to it, and now we have a whole other context.
Sure.
So how?
Sure. A couple of thoughts come to mind. I mean, when I started writing in the first draft of this book, I tended my critique rhetorically at the level of the sentence was continually directed at the left. And then of course, we have our own forms of dissonance or the slow realization, despite the small brain and the big brain, or whatever it is. And it took me a while to realize that the organizing spaces I was the organizing spaces I was familiar with, so much of what I was criticizing was not happening at all. And actually, it was the conversations among these beautiful young people were more nuanced, more flexible, more internationalist, more attentive to sets of difficult choices, and yet one chooses anyway. So part of what, in that last draft, I changed it all to the academic left. It's really a critique of the academic left and not of the left, although there's impoverished forms of left thinking. But really, I realized my book was about the academic left, which of course brings up an even bigger question about shifts and changes. One of the experience was the people I do organize with at that time, mostly around abolitionism and defunding in the wake of 2020, were so sweet and earnest and sincere and open-hearted and open-minded about, oh my God, your book is about the politics are so important and this is so important. And I was like, just what you were talking, half embarrassed. Not about the politics as I'm translating it here, because I think it's all very clear, and I actually stand behind most of my analytic and political points and orientation, even more so given what's happening now, though we might think, oh, how could you be utopian? We can talk more about that. But in the sense of passing it on and saying, like, do you really need to know my reading of Benjamin's reading of Ernst Castells in 1930? That was, so I mean, I think there's we do what we do without apology, and there is a place for it. But I definitely felt like, okay, the next book I want to read, I'm not going to write public-facing, not an airport book for the New Yorker readers, but if the comrades can't read it, if my daughter, who's a sophomore in college and smart but doesn't know any of this, can't read it, what am I doing? So that's also something that shifted. I guess the last thing I'll also say is that it is it's a theoretical critique. It's a critique. Well, two more things. Sorry. It's a critique of recent critical theory that has been extremely influential over the last 30 years. Back to what you were saying, who cares? And I've been, from the beginning, I was struck on the one hand, is this worth putting our time into, what the professors are saying, what the academics are saying? And yet, these, I criticize people I admire, I learned from in the book, who really have shaped the conversation. And to the extent that anything matters within the university, these are some of the biggest and most important voices for those I'm most sympathetic to, and I found it to be so frustrating. Almost always I criticize people who are asking amazing questions, who have powerful insights about this moment, and reach just unacceptable conclusions to my mind. So I'm very frustrated. So I've been torn in the wake of this, like, does any of that matter? Who cares what's happening in the university? But also in some talks I've given, people have been like, one of the gotchas has been something, or not even an honest question like, okay, you have this critique, but you're also talking about solidarity and connections across differences, and you're drawing these sharp lines. There are good guys and bad guys in this book. So that's an open question for all of us. Back to convincing, there's a time to draw a line and say, I mean, I'm not gonna try to destroy you, and we are in the same conversation, in the same fight, but like, no, this is not right, and I'm gonna push back against it. Or is that counterproductive? That's an open kind of question about arguing with comrades, or I don't even know if they're so anti-political, so many of them, that I don't know if they're comrades, but they're interlocutors. They're even really respected interlocutors. So more to say, but I'll stop there. Yeah. Have you had anything like this about disagreeing strongly with people who you kind of agree with politically, but feel like the disagreement matters in a way that you would even be public about?
That was a very intricate question.
What did you say?
That was a very intricate question. A lot of layers to the possibility of the situation. I mean, I think we all have It's
Yeah.
just you're constantly in that debate, and thinking where is it worth it to go in, where it isn't. And I'm just, like, where is it that I want to be in the debate, and where is it that I want to keep doing the work and not being in the debate that takes the time away from doing the work. I think I'm more there now than trying to give facts that I think are pointless. And which actually leads me to the other part of the question that you were asking, which is about where are we finding inspiration.
Oh yeah, right.
Because I'm not finding any inspiration in those conversations.
Yes.
So to me, I don't know. I'm becoming. I was trained as a historian, like just undergraduate, master's, PhD, and now I am finding that it is when I move away from that I am getting most inspired. On the one hand, with crossings with yes, maybe other disciplines, but more so than non-academic. So I'm constantly thinking about how to bring more the arts into the work that I'm doing. And I find more powerful. Like recently, I don't know, this is not a thing in Colombia or in Spanish. I recently came across erasure poetry. And I came around the work of this artist whose name I'm forgetting, and I hope it comes to me, who uses historical documents around slavery and does erasure poetry with them, right? Like erasing and then bringing out a message. That's not a message of, it's a message, not tying it only to his own politics today, but that has been part of his history. So and I find that so much more powerful than books and books and books, that I'm finding other ways of feeling these things, of experiencing them, of telling them outside of my academic ways that I'm finding so very constraining. That's one thing. And the other thing that has been inspiring for me is this shift of attention that I was also mentioning in my talk around, in the case of Colombia, not using history to tell the histories of war, but finding in history these examples of what people have done in the most impossible circumstances to find solidarity, to find cooperation. And I am finding that that's where I see life, right? And these are people who are not are not concerned about who won the elections, and that fight has been going on forever. And how can we learn more about those struggles? I'm starting a project now in the Darien in Colombia, so it's very close to the migrant route. And the story we want to tell there is the story of a community of people who migrated there from inside Colombia in the 1970s, escaping war, which was already ongoing in other regions of the country. They escape there because they find there's free land, so they can live there autonomously. And they get there, people of different religious affiliations, different Christian churches and Catholics, but they decide we are going to live together and make this work together. They start a cooperative to make their economic project be viable. They build the roads together. They do regional planning together, deciding which town is going to deal with the education, which town is going to deal with health of the communities and so on. And they had this running for 2 decades until the war came and tore it down. But the story they want to tell is that story of the solidarity and the cooperation, the thing that worked. And when I go there and I talk, and then again, they live under the Clan del Golfo, who are the right wing. They take care of all the traffic of drugs, arms, people in this region. They live under them, and still they persevere. So yeah, that's where my inspiration is nowadays more than anywhere in school.
I would call that concrete utopianism. I mean, that's a great example of concrete utopianism, and that's also where I look for inspiration. Certainly aesthetics and arts and music and collective experiences always, but I guess it's those places where so many of these different strands of being together otherwise are enacted. And I guess the most recent example is the encampment movement. All last year was quite extraordinary in so many ways. It was extraordinary in the way that here we have a kind of attempt to perform a different kind of university and a different kind of collectivity. Here was also an example of young people doing so under, it's easy to roll your eyes, but under real risk. We saw the riot police, we saw the extreme repression, and they were doing it, and here is a generation that between climate change, militarism, genocide, imperialism, global oligarchy, their eyes are open. They want none of it. They really, I mean, how that squares with the election that just happened, I don't know. We can say more about that, but you know, that is a generation for whom the norms are just, you know, they're open-eyed and absolutely clear-eyed. And a third way in which it's very inspiring is what you were saying, in the past, right? We can think about forms of temporal solidarity too. That's what I meant when I was talking about looking back to less alienated forms of life or political experiments, you know, whether it's the Zapatistas or the Paris Commune or whatever it is. But, you know, and here the encampment movement, and it's fascinating, and this maybe brings us back to the question of history otherwise, or thinking about history in a different kind of way. We don't have a good way of recognizing and valuing the way in which all of these historical moments are embedded in the encampments. You have Black Lives Matter, you have Standing Rock, you have Occupy, you have forms of, you know, you have the Zapatistas who were so important to the altered globalization movement, going all the way back to the Paris Commune in a certain way. If we want to, you know, we can debate that. But even in the last 15 years, there's this repertoire of moves and a kind of inherited political understanding. Some of it is very, you know, intentional and knowledgeable, some of it is diffuse, but that is the way in which, and this is back to like non-conventional modes of thinking about temporality when we're thinking about history. There's a kind of repetition or an untimeliness. All these historical layers are packed into something like these encampments in ways that I find promising and powerful. Are they going to be enough to, you know, save us from ourselves? You know, who knows?
Well, thanks for that segue, because maybe I'll just, no, I really appreciate that, because it was a really huge presence and experience on this campus in particular. I think it was the one of, if not the longest running encampment in the country. So thank you for that, and the reference back to history. So I'll just have our last question before we open it up to everybody else, just return to the overall theme of reparations. And how, given both of your really provocative and important challenges to ideas of the kind of linear time and like roots and legacies and you know, your much more fluid idea of everything everywhere all at once, where does reparations, kind of what's your, what definition or understanding of reparations is important to you? You talked a bit about this in a really useful way that I hadn't, it was fun because I hadn't heard you talk about it in that way before, about sort of reparative pedagogies or reparative public history. Yeah, I mean, given that reparations both as an idea, again, of like asserting that the past is not past, but also as a movement. I mean, in this country, I just think about like, it's a 200-year-old or more plus movement, and then the most recent, the history of which is John Conyers like introducing the same bill in Congress over and over and over and over and over again, and then passing it on to you know, his who's still introducing it over and over again. And so that idea of kind of like a movement as like resisting the like foreclosure of what's possible historically. So just thinking about either of that, just to bring it back to the theme of the, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as people who resist this linear history.
Yeah, well I will start by saying that definitely the way I've been approaching it is just from the very basic premise that reparations needs to be thought of historically, right? That it cannot be thought only of a matter of the financial compensation, which has been happening. I'm going to speak more from the Colombian perspective. I know that that's also been in the debate here, but in Colombia it's being done materially, right? Like the government has set up funds and they are trying to sort of take back, repair people, right? Take them back to where before the war by restoring land, for example, or giving people who are within this category of victim a financial amount, or you know, all the memory efforts. But I think that view of repairing is, again, stuck in a very recent past, right? Like we can repair, like how back do we need to go for you to feel that the war didn't touch you? Right? And it's never enough. These violence are very, very, very old. So there's no sum of money that's going to bring you back there. And also, it's not about the sum of money. It's about how can you repair if the system stays untouched, right? You can give somebody whatever amount of money, but if the system is the same, that money is going to flow away as fast as it can, right? So it's just, so back to the main answer. I think that if we don't approach that historically, right, taking into consideration that what we are repairing has layers and layers and layers, that it's very old, that it's so ingrained in our ways of relating to each other. That repairing, we have to, I like to think about this as repairing the ways in which we relate to each other, right? And I try to bring that into my historical work. If I do historical work there from my ivory tower, taking information from people and publishing it, that's not very reparative, right? But if we are to repair the ways in which we relate, in which we live together, like you were saying a moment ago, being together otherwise. That's repairing, but that's not, we have to bring into the conversation or keep in mind that historicity.
Yes, there's so much that, there are a lot of, I'm more familiar with the debate over the reparations of for slavery, Atlantic slavery in both the US and in the Caribbean. I'm certainly no expert, but, the arguments against, there are many arguments against it. Partially this idea that, there's this fiction, M.A. Césaire used to say, like, you can't pay an unpayable debt. And if we do this, we would somehow be participating in this idea that the balance is clean, that the debt is paid, that things are settled. And I think that's closely related to the problem of, money without transforming the underlying relations is very problematic. Saidiya Hartman has a critique of reparations that basically criticizes the idea of, begging for goods from the powers that be, again, reproducing that servile position. And yet I find reparations extremely intriguing and powerful, because both the law and liberal historiography, or conventional history, has built into it. So I'm going to link reparations to the temporality in history and politics, as you're suggesting. I'm going to try. Both law and conventional history has built into it a certain set of assumptions about temporal scales of harm, about cause and effect, about agency and intention and will and therefore responsibility. There's the moment we think of harm and the moment we think of debt or justice, there are all kinds of temporal assumptions built in there. And both the liberal legal order and conventional history has a very difficult time kind of pointing to, there's a realism or empiricism to both that can't deal with something like systemic harm, structural violence, transgenerational harm, collective responsibility. This idea that something then not only has to be paid for now, but is still harming, is still producing harm. We just can't get our minds around that. So I do think that we both need very different notions, epistemologically different epistemologies that include different notions of time, or the relationship between time and politics, or time and social life, to kind of grasp reparations, but conversely, possibly kind of pushing and throwing our support behind reparations movements, even if they're not speaking in these registers, I think could have a possibly very powerfully subversive effect in cracking or disrupting some of these notions of causality and punctual harm, and I didn't do it, collective responsibility, systemic. So I think there's something very intriguing there, that it really cuts across the logic of both liberal jurisprudence and conventional historiography that is worth exploring, even though I'm very mindful, so I'm torn. of all the downsides and, you know, the logistics. And in the Caribbean, it's a status project, and my politics don't lead me to want to give all this money to these, you know, states. I want to turn the imperial war into a civil war. In the U.S., you know, who gets it? And then all the ontologies of racial classification, you know, who knows? But I think it's something that I want to put on the table for these reasons, or keep on the table.
Yeah, and I think that being torn is only if you're defining reparations fairly narrowly as like a specific material thing, whereas as opposed to kind of like historically informed redistribution that you mentioned earlier, or I think Wendell quoted Taiwo, quoting somebody else about historically informed world building. So now I've totally lost track of time, which is my only job. 5 minutes. Oh, it's 5 o'clock now? Crap. Oh, crap, sorry, my bad. I would, do we have time for questions?
35 minutes.
Oh, 35 minutes? Great. Exactly, like I said, excellent, we have 35 minutes, which is plenty of time for questions.
Plenty of